Hello, this video is brought to you by the Cooking Club at Dr. Curnew's clinic. We want to thank you for tuning into our new episode, Keeping the Tag on Expiration Dates. So before we begin, we invite you to look around your fridge or pantry and examine whether or not there are any expired food items. Chances are, most of us have at least one item lying around even though the best before or expiration date has passed. And most likely, we'll continue to use or consume this item regardless, as long as it doesn't taste bad. Now here we find ourselves wondering, why doesn't this food taste rancid even though it's past its expiration date? In this video, we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into this idea, debunking some myths that surround expiration dates, and learning about when expired food may actually still be safe to eat. So the first important distinction that we want to teach is how to differentiate between best by or before, use by, and expiration dates. A common misconception may be that these dates are all referring to when the food product becomes unsafe to eat, but this is not really the case. So for best by or before dates, they're really telling you to consume your products by this date for optimal flavor, freshness, texture, nutritional value, and quality, but it doesn't mean the food will necessarily spoil after this date. In fact, with proper storage, it may be good for months or even years after. And similarly, the use by date indicates the last date recommended for product use at its peak quality. It's not a true expiration or safety date that indicates spoilage or danger, except for when it's used on infant formulas. Now, expiration dates with phrases like expires on or do not use after are to be watched out for more closely. They are only required on certain foods with strict compositional and nutritional specifications that likely won't be met after that expiration date. These products may include, but are not limited to, infant formulas, nutritional supplements like vitamins, over-the-counter medications, baking mixes, jams, and formulated liquid diets. And lastly, a quick note on the sell-by dates. So the sell-by date is one that's often misinterpreted by consumers. So actually they are intended for retailers in helping to ensure a proper turnover of their store products so that they can still have an ample shelf life after consumers buy them. All that being said, consumers should not use these as a measure for themselves. So now that we've gotten these definitions distinguished from one another, let's examine some common food items and their shelf lives. Straight off the bat, we wanted to share a list of some food items that can last virtually forever. So for these items, you typically don't have to be too wary about their best before dates. These products may include vinegars, honey, vanilla or other extracts, sugar, salt, corn syrup, molasses, par-cooked or instant oats, and spices, other than the fact that the spices may lose their potency over time. But also keep in mind that regular steel cut or rolled oats will last around 1 year before going rancid. Next, let's move on to flour, a pretty common pantry staple. So first, we should note that white flour, which is heavily refined, will be fine to use for more than a year, especially if it's stored properly. Whole wheat or whole grain flours, in comparison, will gain a metallic or soapy odor within a few months. And the same principle applies to rice, where refined white rice can be stored for years, while brown rice lasts for only a couple months. So as a rule of thumb, white flour and rice have less nutrients, but also a longer shelf life. For bread, those with higher moisture content spoil faster due to mold growth. And so regardless of what flour is used to make it, this rate of going bad will depend on other factors, like their moisture. For butter, they can typically last for 4 weeks after their best before date, opened or not. For oils, their shelf life can vary depending on storage. For example, oils that are stored in sealed cans are nearly indestructible, whereas sealed glass bottles or open containers are much less so. So to check whether the oil is still good or not, look for a sour odor. For things like salad dressings and condiments too, bottles with narrow squeeze openings are much more effective at preventing spoilage than open-mouthed jars. For these substances, though, they are typically fine long past their best before dates, and that is because they have high levels of acidity. So this might be important to keep in mind. Acidity, fats, and salts are enemies of bacterial growth. Now for some actual produce. So eggs surprisingly take a long time to go bad. All egg cartons will have a Julian date printed on their carton, which is a 3-digit number ranging from 001 for January 1st to 365, signifying December 31st. This indicates the date that the eggs were packed, and the sell-by date could be up to another 30 days after the pack date. So basically, that means refrigerated eggs will be good for even 3 to 5 weeks or more after their Julian date. To see whether an egg is still good to eat, you can always use the simple egg test, and that's where you put an egg into a bowl of water and examine what happens. So a good egg will sink and a bad egg will float. Moving on, for milk, it may be good to drink for a couple days after its specified date if opened already, but it is best to decide by other signs of spoilage to make sure. Milk goes bad when its pH hits 4.6, and that happens when a protein called casein starts to clump. So if the milk smells sour or looks chunky, don't drink it. For most meats, it is best to be conservative and on the side of caution, because after the best before date, it becomes pretty much susceptible to bacterial growth. Typically, spoiled meat will present with a sour or putrid smell, have discoloration, as well as maybe a slimy layer, which is actually a bacterial film. So we also thought that many of you may be wondering about leftovers. To touch on it very briefly, leftovers will typically be safe for 3 to 4 days in the refrigerator, but given that they are pre-cooked foods, afterwards, after that duration of 3 to 4 days, bacteria may begin to grow and the risk of food poisoning will also rise. Lastly, we wanted to do a quick segment. So have you ever noticed an expiration date on your frozen food and wondered why it's there? We know that the common conception is that frozen foods are safe to eat indefinitely. And if the food has indeed been preserved well, under conditions that are 0 degrees Celsius or less, that will technically hold true. However, it doesn't mean that the food will taste as good forever. If the expiration date on the frozen food package has passed, chances are that the food will still be okay to consume, but its flavor, color, or texture may be compromised. So here are some signs that frozen food has gone bad. First, freezer burns. If they are present, it is because the food has been exposed to air. Basically, that means they are still safe to eat, but they may be dry or have lost their optimal texture. Second, examine how the food presents after thawing. If it smells rancid, has a mushy or slimy texture, or is darkened significantly compared to before, there is likely some spoilage. So for best measure, what you should do after defrosting the food is to cook or heat it properly. That's because bacteria can't grow in the freezer, but it can still survive. Also, one last thing worthy of noting may be that some vegetables like cabbage, potato, celery, and cucumbers are not well suited for freezing. That's because of their high water contents. So that means that after thawing, they will become mushy. Before we end off, we wanted to segue into a few tips and solutions for maximizing the storage of foods and avoiding spoilage. So one of the best and simplest methods for food preservation is, of course, storing the food in the freezer. So as we touched on earlier, bacterial growth will be stopped in the freezer, so the food will last much longer when you freeze it. For instance, you can freeze up your bread, leftovers, or anything you think that you won't be having anytime soon. Second, you can use the method of dehydration or removing moisture. And similarly to freezing, it also stops the growth of bacteria in the foods, so certain items like mangoes, other fruits, or fish can be preserved by this method to last much longer. Storing food in airtight cans or containers will also help slow the growth of germs. And lastly, for general foods, adding salt or excess sugar when applicable can act as effective preservatives. So for instance, in the form of pickling or turning things into jam or jellies. But of course, it's important to remember to only use this method when applicable and to remain conscious of your sodium and glucose intakes. For oils to extend their life, you want to avoid heat, so make sure not to keep them near or above the stove top. For milks, look for the sign ultra high temperature or UHT on the label, which indicate that the milk has been pasteurized at high temperatures. What that does is that it destroys the viruses and bacteria, meaning the milk will last much longer. So finally, we wanted to introduce something called Food Keeper. This is something that was developed by the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. It has a searchable catalog for different types of foods and also tells you the appropriate storage methods for more than 400 items. So when in doubt on how to make a food item last longer, please refer to this website, which is seen on the slide and also linked in the description box below. So to sum it up, this entire video may be just a reiteration of common knowledge to a lot of you, but it also does introduce some important tips and tricks to keep in mind when it comes to proper food storage. Overall, we hope that you've taken away a thing or two, and thank you again for tuning in.